Commander David opened his eyes to the sound of a low, steady beeping. The darkness around him was complete, like being trapped inside a tomb. His body felt heavy, frozen solid from the long sleep of the cryopod. Ice crystals covered his ancient uniform, the one that had been sewn together with patches from a dozen different worlds over the centuries. He pushed his hands against the cold metal chamber and slowly lifted himself up. The cryopod hissed as it released him. Frost fell from his shoulders like tears as his feet touched the cold floor beneath him. David took a moment to breathe, to feel the air in his lungs. It was recycled and stale, tasting of dust and machine oil. He was alive. After all these years of sleep, he was still alive. David moved his arms slowly, trying to get the feeling back into his body. His neural implant began to activate, sending information directly into his mind. Mission logs flooded his thoughts instantly. He was Commander David Rivers, the last backup commander of the Meridian Station. He had been frozen 247 years ago as a safety measure, insurance against the worst possible catastrophe. Well, catastrophe had come, and apparently, it had decided to leave him behind. He walked forward through the darkness, his footsteps echoing off the metal walls. Emergency lights flickered on as he moved, creating long shadows that danced around him. The corridors of the station were empty and silent, a ghost ship floating through the black void of space. David had worked on this station for 3 years before going into cryogenic sleep. He knew these corridors well, had walked them 1,000 times. Now they felt like the halls of a tomb. David made his way to the observation deck, a large chamber with massive windows that looked out into the void. As he stepped inside, his breath caught in his throat. Outside there was nothing. No stars. No distant nebulae glowing in the darkness. No other ships. Nothing but an endless empty black that stretched on forever. The station's external sensors showed readings that made his mind hurt. They were adrift in a pocket of space, a bubble of reality cut off from the rest of the universe. The physics readings were all wrong, like someone had taken the rules of the universe and twisted them into something unrecognizable. David spent the next several hours running diagnostics on the dormant systems throughout the station. Most of them were barely functional. The crew quarters he found along the way were empty and abandoned. He discovered personal belongings scattered everywhere. A framed photograph showing a family standing together on Earth, smiling at the camera. A child's toy sitting on a bed, gathering dust. A journal left open on a desk, its pages filled with handwriting that had faded with age. But there were no bodies. No signs of struggle or violence. Just the overwhelming feeling of abandonment. In the captain's quarters, David found something that made his heart race. A small device was still glowing faintly on the desk, its power reserve somehow still intact after all these years. He picked it up carefully and activated it. A holographic message appeared before him, shimmering in the air like a ghost made of light and memory. The message was from Captain Emily Chin, the station commander who had led the crew all those years ago. Her voice came through clear and strong, though David could hear the fear underneath every word. The captain looked exactly as he remembered her, untouched by time, preserved in this digital recording like a memory trapped in amber. "If you're hearing this message," Captain Chin began, her voice steady but sad, "then something has gone terribly wrong. Something has gone wrong with our mission here at the Meridian Station." David sat down slowly on the captain's chair as he listened to the recorded message. Captain Chin explained that the station wasn't just a simple research outpost as the Alliance had told everyone. It was something far more complicated and far more dangerous. The station was a cage, built specifically to contain something that the crew had discovered and pulled from the void of space itself. "We call it the Leviathan," Captain Chin said, her voice dropping lower. "It is not a creature, not exactly. It is a force, an intelligence, something that exists in a way we do not fully understand." The captain explained that the research team had been studying the Leviathan for months, trying to understand its nature before the Alliance military could arrive and take it away to be used as a weapon. But something had gone wrong. The containment fields that held the creature were starting to fail. The Leviathan was not hostile, Captain Chin said, but it was desperate. It had been alone in the void for millions of years, and when it finally encountered humanity, it had reached out to them with hope. Instead of helping the creature, the crew had trapped it and locked it away. "The Leviathan is dying," Captain Chin said, and David could hear tears in her voice now. "And when it dies, the entire pocket of space will collapse. Everything in it will be destroyed. The station will be destroyed. You will be destroyed." David leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk tightly. This was not the situation he had imagined. This was far worse than anything he had feared. I am taking the Pathfinder and attempting to jump out of this pocket of space, Captain Chin continued. I am going to try to reach Alliance Command and warn them about what is happening here. But I am not optimistic. I am leaving you with a final mission, David. If you wake up, if you somehow survive, I need you to repair the containment systems. I need you to save the Leviathan. Only if that creature survives will the void stabilize. Only then will you have any chance of escape. The message ended, and the hologram faded away slowly, dissolving into nothing. David sat alone in the captain's quarters, his mind racing with terrible possibilities. He walked to the station's main computer terminal and accessed the network to check the containment fields. Deep below the station in a section marked Omega, the containment systems were indeed failing. The power readings showed a steady, relentless decline. His calculations, when he ran them through the terminal, gave him a number that made his blood run cold. He had approximately 72 hours before the containment systems experienced complete cascade failure. 72 hours before the Leviathan died, and the entire pocket of space began to collapse. 72 hours to save them all. 3 days had passed since Commander David woke up from his long sleep, and those 3 days had been the loneliest of his entire life. He spent them walking through the empty corridors of the Meridian Station, checking systems and trying to understand what had happened to the crew. He ate from the emergency food supplies, drank water that tasted like metal, and slept in short bursts in the captain's quarters because it felt less lonely there than in his own room. On the morning of the 4th day, something changed. David was in the main control room, staring at the failing containment systems, when his neural implant began to buzz and hum. It was a strange sensation, like something reaching out to touch the back of his mind. At first he thought it was a malfunction. His implant was old technology, ancient by modern standards, and he wondered if the long sleep had damaged it somehow. Then he realized what was happening. The station's computer system was trying to contact him. Not with words or text messages, but with a direct connection that sent information pouring into his brain like water through an open dam. David staggered backward, gripping the edge of the control console to keep himself from falling. The sensation was overwhelming and disorienting, like someone was sorting through his memories and thoughts without permission. When the sensation finally stopped, David found himself standing in the same spot, breathing heavily, his hands shaking. The computer had found something. Deep in the station's archive systems, buried under layers of security protocols and locked doors, there was a message. A message that had been preserved for centuries, waiting specifically for him to find it. David made his way down through the station toward the archive section. This was one of the most restricted areas of the entire facility, a place where the most sensitive research and classified information was kept. The corridors here were narrower and darker than the rest of the station. The walls were covered with warning symbols and codes that meant nothing to him. The air felt colder here, or maybe that was just his imagination. When he reached the archive chamber, he found a single computer terminal sitting in the center of a large empty room. The screen glowed softly in the darkness, waiting for him. David approached it slowly, almost afraid of what he might find. He placed his hand on the scanner pad, and the terminal accepted his command codes immediately. Whoever had created this message had set it up so that only a commander with his specific authorization could access it. The screen flickered to life and suddenly, a hologram appeared before him. It was Captain Emily Chin again, her form shimmering in the air like a ghost made of light. But this wasn't a recording like the one David had found in the captain's quarters. This was something different. This was a personal message, and it was meant for his eyes alone. David watched as the holographic Captain Chin began to speak. Her voice was quieter now, more urgent, filled with a desperation that had not been present in the first message. She looked tired, like she had not slept in days. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hands trembled as she spoke. "David, if you are seeing this message, then my first message has reached you," Captain Chin said. "And I know that you understand the situation now. I know that you understand that the Leviathan is dying, and that the void is collapsing. But there is more to the story than I could explain in my first message. There is so much more that you need to understand." David sat down on the floor in front of the hologram, completely focused on every word that Captain Chin was saying. He knew this was important. He could feel it in his bones, in the ancient uniform he was wearing, in every cell of his body. "The crew did not abandon the station without reason," Captain Chin continued. "We did not leave you behind because we did not care about you. We left because we had to. Because the Leviathan was beginning to teach us things, David. It was showing us truths about the universe that humanity was never meant to know. At least not yet." The holographic captain moved her hands as she spoke, gesturing to emphasize her words. The Leviathan comes from a place outside of our universe, David. It comes from a dimension so far removed from our own that our minds cannot even properly conceive of it. It has been traveling through the void for millions of years, seeking others like itself, seeking companionship in an endless sea of darkness and emptiness. David felt something twist inside his chest. The Leviathan was not a monster. It was something lonely and desperate just like him. Just like all of humanity was in its own way. When we first detected the Leviathan, we thought it was a threat, Captain Chin said. We built the containment fields around it. We locked it away. But then we learned the truth. The Leviathan was not trying to attack us. It was reaching out to us. It was trying to communicate. It was trying to ask for help. Captain Chen's holographic face twisted with sadness and regret. We kept it trapped anyway. And now it is dying, and the containment is failing, and everything that we have built here will be destroyed. The void that has contained the Leviathan for so long is collapsing because the Leviathan itself is collapsing. Its life force is fading. Its consciousness is dimming. The hologram flickered for a moment, and when it came back, Captain Chen was looking directly at David, speaking directly to him in a way that felt incredibly personal. You must reverse the containment matrix, David, she said. You must release the Leviathan from its prison. Only then can it stabilize the void. Only then can it use its power to stop the collapse and restore balance to this pocket of space. This is your mission now. This is why we left you behind. Because we believed that you would understand. We believed that you would choose compassion over fear. The hologram of Captain Chin reached out her hand, as if she could touch David through the light and time that separated them. Save the Leviathan, David. Set it free. And perhaps in doing so you will save yourself as well. The message ended. The hologram dissolved into nothing, leaving David sitting alone in the darkness of the archive chamber. But he was no longer afraid. He finally understood what he had to do. Commander David spent the next 6 hours preparing himself for the descent into the lower levels of the station. He gathered supplies from the emergency storage areas, items that might be useful in places where the systems had been failing for centuries. He found a suit designed to protect against radiation and extreme temperatures, though he was not sure if he would actually need it. He filled a bag with tools, rope, flashlights, and medical supplies. He took a small device that could measure the energy readings around the containment fields so he would know when he was getting close to the Leviathan. Before he left the upper levels, David accessed the station's main computer one more time. He downloaded every piece of information he could find about the containment systems, studying the technical documents and diagrams until his head felt like it might explode. He needed to understand how the fields worked, what kept the Leviathan trapped, and most importantly, how to reverse the polarity of the system as Captain Chin had instructed him to do. When he was ready, David made his way down. The elevator that normally carried crew members between the upper and lower levels was not working, so he had to use the emergency stairwell. It was a long climb down through section after section of the station. The air grew colder as he descended, and the walls seemed to press in around him. His footsteps echoed off the metal stairs, creating a rhythm that became almost hypnotic as he went deeper and deeper into the belly of the station. The lower decks were a maze of corridors and sealed bulkheads. Many of the doors would not open, locked by systems that had frozen in place long ago. David had to find alternate routes, squeezing through maintenance tunnels and crawling through spaces barely wide enough for his shoulders to fit through. His ancient uniform, already patched with materials from a dozen different worlds, picked up new tears and scratches as he moved through the tight spaces. He did not care. None of that mattered anymore. Only reaching the Leviathan mattered. As he descended deeper, David began to feel something strange happening inside his mind. It was not painful, but it was definitely unusual. It was like someone or something was trying to reach out to him from a great distance away. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and isolation. But the feeling grew stronger with each level he descended. The feeling was warmth. Not physical warmth, but something else. Something that felt almost like consciousness reaching out to touch another consciousness. David realized what was happening. The Leviathan was aware of him. It could sense his presence in the station and it was trying to communicate with him. David stopped in the middle of a corridor, pressing his back against the cold metal wall. He closed his eyes and tried to open his mind, tried to accept the strange sensation that was flowing through him. Images began to form in his thoughts. They were not pictures exactly, but more like feelings and impressions. He saw endless darkness. He felt loneliness so profound that it made his heart ache. He experienced millions of years of traveling through the void, always alone, never meeting anyone else like himself. Then he felt something else. He felt hope. The Leviathan had hope because it had finally encountered another intelligent being. It had hope because humanity was here, and perhaps humanity could help break the terrible isolation that had defined its entire existence. David opened his eyes and continued his descent. He was no longer afraid. He understood now. The Leviathan was not a monster or a threat. It was a being that deserved compassion and help, not imprisonment and fear. After what felt like hours of climbing and crawling and squeezing through tight spaces, David finally reached subsection Omega. This was the deepest part of the station, the place where the containment fields held the Leviathan prisoner. The corridors here were different from the rest of the station. The walls were covered with strange patterns and symbols that glowed faintly with residual energy. The air itself seemed to vibrate with power, though whether it was the power of the containment fields or the power of the Leviathan itself, David could not tell. He came to a large observation window made of reinforced transparent material. Beyond the window was the containment chamber, and inside that chamber was the Leviathan. David's breath caught in his throat. He had tried to imagine what he would see, had tried to prepare himself for the encounter, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of what was before him. The Leviathan was not a creature in the traditional sense. It was not a body with a head and limbs and organs. Instead, it seemed to be made of light and energy and something else that David's mind could not quite process. The creature was vast, much larger than the chamber that supposedly contained it. It seemed to exist partially in this dimension and partially in other dimensions that David could not perceive. The Leviathan turned its attention toward David. The commander felt the creature's consciousness touch his mind directly, without any barrier between them. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at the same time. David fell to his knees in front of the observation window, tears streaming down his face. In that moment, David understood everything. He understood what the Leviathan was. He understood what it wanted. He understood what he had to do. The creature was not reaching out in anger or in hunger. It was reaching out in desperation, seeking help from the only being in this pocket of space who might be able to provide it. David placed his hand against the cold glass of the observation window. He spoke softly, though he knew the Leviathan could hear him even if he had shouted. "I understand," David said. "I will help you. I promise." The Leviathan's presence in his mind brightened, filling him with a feeling of gratitude and hope so powerful that David thought his heart might burst from the intensity of it. The creature had been waiting so long for someone to understand. And now, finally, someone did. David stood up slowly and looked at the control panels that lined the walls of the chamber. He knew what he had to do. He had to reverse the containment matrix. He had to set the Leviathan free. Commander David stood in front of the containment control panels, studying the complex system of switches, buttons and screens that had been built to keep the Leviathan prisoner for so long. The panels were covered in dust and rust, their lights blinking weakly as the power reserves continued to drain away. David knew that he had limited time. The containment fields were failing steadily, and if he did not act soon, the entire system would collapse on its own, taking the station and everything in it down with it. The engineering section was located several corridors away from the observation chamber. David had to navigate through more narrow passages and sealed doors to reach it. Many of the corridors in the lower levels were partially flooded with water that had leaked from broken pipes. His boots splashed through the dark puddles as he moved forward. Emergency lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows on the walls around him. When David finally reached the engineering section, he found it in a state of complete decay. Equipment that had once been cutting-edge technology was now covered in layers of dust and corrosion. Cables hung from the ceiling like dead snakes. Panels were open, their internal systems exposed and deteriorating. It looked like a graveyard of machinery, a tomb filled with the forgotten tools of a civilization that had abandoned its own creation. David knew that he could not repair these systems using normal methods. The station had been floating in the void for too long. Too many components had failed. Too many spare parts no longer existed. Instead, he would have to get creative. He would have to jury-rig solutions from whatever materials he could find scattered throughout the lower levels. In the emergency supplies storage area, David discovered a collection of items that had been left behind by the previous crew. There were backup power cells, though many of them were no longer functional. There were cables and wires, some of which still seemed to have conductivity despite their age. There were circuit boards from older technology, things that predated the current systems by decades. There were also physical manuals, actual books printed on paper, which was unusual in a modern space station. These books, David realized, were the only records that had survived intact. Digital files had corrupted over time, but paper endured. David spent hours reading through the technical manuals, learning how the containment systems worked from the ground up. He discovered that the system was not as complex as he had initially thought. The containment matrix was essentially a series of graviton projectors that created a field around the Leviathan, holding it in place and preventing it from expanding outward into the rest of the station. The power that ran these projectors came from a central reactor, which was now running on emergency backup power that was nearly depleted. The connection between David and the Leviathan grew stronger as he worked. The creature was teaching him, sharing knowledge across the vast distance that separated their two forms of consciousness. Through their connection, David began to understand things about the universe that he had never known before. He learned about dimensions beyond his own, about forms of energy that human science had never discovered, about the nature of consciousness itself. The Leviathan showed David visions of its home dimension, a place of incredible beauty where creatures like itself lived in harmony with one another. It showed him memories of its long journey through the void, millions of years of traveling alone through the darkness, searching for others of its kind. The creature had been so lonely, so desperate for companionship, that when it finally encountered the human research team, it had reached out with hope in its heart. David worked through the night, carefully disconnecting old power cables and rerouting them to create new pathways through the system. He used materials from the emergency supplies to create makeshift power conduits. He built connection points from pieces of copper wire and circuit board components. Slowly, carefully, he began to reverse the polarity of the containment matrix, just as Captain Chen had instructed him to do. As dawn broke on the surface of whatever world might exist outside this pocket of space, David completed his work. He stood in front of the main control panel in the engineering section, his hand hovering over the final switch that would change everything. He thought about Captain Chen and the rest of the crew, who had made the difficult choice to abandon the station. He thought about the Leviathan, trapped in its prison for so long, waiting for someone to understand and help it. David flipped the switch. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The station shook with a force that nearly knocked David to the ground. Alarms began to sound throughout the entire facility, a wailing cry of machinery responding to catastrophic change. The power readings spiked wildly as the graviton projectors reversed their polarity, changing from inward pointing to outward pointing in a single instant. The containment field dissolved in a cascade of exotic particles that looked like fireworks made of pure energy. David watched through the station's cameras as the Leviathan surged outward from its prison, finally free after centuries of captivity. The creature did not flee or attack. Instead, it did something far more remarkable. The Leviathan wrapped itself around the station, encompassing it completely within its vast form of energy and light. The pocket of space that had been collapsed and dying began to suddenly expand and transform. Dimensions that had been twisted and wrong started to realign themselves, returning to their proper configuration. The void that had been empty for so long suddenly began to fill with something new, something that looked like pathways of pure space-time, corridors that led outward to infinity. David felt the station moving. The Leviathan was carrying it, not with force or violence, but gently, carefully, like a parent carrying a sleeping child. The creature was taking the station home, taking David home, taking both of them out of the void and toward something better. As the station began its journey outward, David realized something profound. The Leviathan had not just saved itself. It had saved him as well. In helping the creature, he had found his own path to salvation. The two of them, human and energy being, had become connected in a way that transcended the normal boundaries of species and form and consciousness. The resurrection had begun. The emergence of the Meridian station from the void was sudden and unexpected. One moment, the station was floating in the strange twisted space that existed outside normal reality. The next moment, it burst through a barrier of shimmering energy and into a region of space that was filled with stars and distant galaxies and the familiar signs of normal physics. The transition was so abrupt that alarms sounded throughout the entire station, and David was thrown against the wall of the control room with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. When David recovered and managed to get back to his feet, he immediately accessed the station's external cameras. What he saw made his heart race. Outside the windows of the Meridian station, there were ships. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them, perhaps. They represented every species and civilization that humanity had ever encountered, and many that David had never seen before. Some of the ships were sleek and modern, clearly belonging to advanced technological societies. Others were bulkier and more primitive, representing civilizations that had only recently discovered space travel. All of them had one thing in common. They were all pointing weapons at the Meridian station. The communication channels immediately exploded with activity. Messages were being transmitted in hundreds of different languages, all of them expressing the same sentiment. Stand down. Surrender immediately. This is the Alliance Defense Fleet. You are surrounded. David felt his stomach drop. He had hoped that emerging from the void would mean salvation, but instead, it appeared that he had only traded one death trap for another. The Alliance had found them and they had brought an entire military force with them. David knew what would happen next. They would board the station. They would take the Leviathan and attempt to weaponize it. Everything that Captain Chin had feared would come to pass. But then something changed. The Leviathan, still wrapped around the station in its protective embrace, began to communicate. Not with David but with the entire fleet surrounding them. The creature's consciousness reached out across the void of space, touching the minds of every commander and captain and soldier in the Alliance Defense Fleet simultaneously. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every weapon system in the fleet powered down at the same moment. Every trigger that had been ready to fire went silent. All across the assembled ships, soldiers and officers fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of consciousness that the Leviathan was projecting into their minds. The creature was not attacking them or threatening them. It was simply showing them the truth. It was showing them what loneliness truly meant. It was showing them what it felt like to travel through endless darkness for millions of years without finding anyone else like yourself. David sat down heavily in the captain's chair as he watched this unfold on the screens before him. The Leviathan was not using violence to communicate. It was using empathy. It was using understanding. The Alliance fleet began to stand down completely. Weapons were secured. Hostile postures were abandoned. Within minutes, the fleet that had been ready to attack the Meridian station was instead moving into formation around it, not as an attacking force but as an escort. They were going to guide the station to the nearest Alliance space station, where David and the Leviathan could be properly received. During the transit through normal space, David received a message on the station's communication system. It was from Admiral Rachel Mitchell, the commander of the Alliance Defense Fleet. She requested a direct meeting with the commander of the Meridian station. David agreed, and several hours later, Admiral Mitchell docked her personal shuttle with the station's main airlock. Admiral Mitchell was a tall woman with gray hair and stern features. She walked onto the station with a small security detail, but David immediately ordered the security detail to stand down. There was no threat here. There was only the beginning of something new. "Commander Rivers," Admiral Mitchell said, extending her hand in greeting. "I am Admiral Rachel Mitchell of the Alliance Defense Command. I need to speak with you about what just happened out there." David shook her hand firmly. "Admiral Mitchell, welcome to the Meridian Station. I understand this must all be very confusing. But I need to tell you something important about what we have discovered here." They sat together in the captain's quarters, and David told Admiral Mitchell everything. He told her about the Leviathan and how long it had been traveling through the void alone. He told her about Captain Emily Chen and the crew who had abandoned the station to protect the creature from being weaponized. He told her about his own journey from the upper levels of the station to the containment chambers, and about the connection that he had formed with the Leviathan. Admiral Mitchell listened quietly to every word. When David finished, she was silent for a long time, simply staring at the floor in front of her. Finally she spoke. "If what you are telling me is true, then everything we believed about this creature was wrong," Admiral Mitchell said. "We sent a fleet to capture it and bring it back to Alliance territory so that we could study it and potentially develop military applications. But you are telling me that this creature is not a weapon. It is not a threat. It is simply a being that has been seeking help and companionship." "That is exactly what I am telling you," David said. "And more than that, Admiral, the Leviathan has something to offer us. Something that could change everything for humanity and for all of the Alliance species." David spent the next several hours explaining the Leviathan's proposal to Admiral Mitchell. The creature was willing to share the pathways it had discovered through the void, the shortcuts through space-time that it had learned to navigate over millions of years of travel. These pathways could be used to connect every corner of the universe. Trade routes could be established that would take weeks instead of years. Civilizations could share knowledge and culture and resources on a scale that had never been possible before. The price was simple: respect, understanding, companionship. The Leviathan wanted to be treated as an equal, not as a tool or a weapon or a resource to be exploited. It wanted to form an alliance with humanity and all the other species of the galactic community. Admiral Mitchell's expression slowly changed as she understood what David was describing. The implications were staggering. This could usher in a new age of peace and cooperation across the entire galaxy. "I will need to report this to the Alliance Council," Admiral Mitchell said.